The Peter Schiff Show.
And we are back on the Peter Schiff Show. Tom Woods in for Peter, joined by Pat Buchanan, whom you all know and who is the author most recently of Suicide of a Superpower, Will America Survive to 2025? We had him on this program to talk about that. He is the well-known political commentator, author, syndicated columnist, politician, and broadcaster. Pat Buchanan, welcome to the Peter Schiff Show.
How you doing, Tom?
Very well. I'm very glad to be talking to you once again.
Good to talk with you. How's life out there in, where is it, Oklahoma?
Well, I live in Topeka, Kansas, but my wife is from Oklahoma.
Okay.
Who knew I would be in the heartland
Middle
of
America.
That's right. Well, we're hanging on all right out here, trying to resist the best we can the onslaught of our betters in D.C. But at some point I want to talk about what's going on in the GOP right now, and Peter King flinging insults at Rand Paul and Chris Christie and all that. But I want to start off with Obama and Russia and Putin and Snowden. How do you think he's handling this whole situation? He said on the Jay Leno program that he felt like Russia was acting in a kind of a Cold War mentality spirit. What do you think about all this?
Well, I've just got in my typewriter, my machine here, a column titled An Apologia Pro Vladimir Putin.
Nice. Okay, let's hear it.
It leads off with that quote, there have been times when they slip back into Cold War thinking and a Cold War mentality, said Obama. Now, my view is that the Russians, they are very miffed with the United States for a variety of reasons, and they've taken this small opportunity to do what they think they've got a right to do, which they know is going to antagonize the Americans, and they're doing it. But I don't think we ought to make too big a deal out of this with the Russians. I think I can understand, and I think the American people and the American nation's got to understand what the Russians have gone through, and how Putin sees the United States of America, moving NATO right up to its borders, bringing in the 3 Baltic republics, trying to bring in Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, cutting them out of the Caspian Sea oil through that pipeline, sending the National Endowment for National Endowment for Democracy and its agents into his country. I think they think the United States has been treating them contemptuously, and they're responding in kind, and I think the United States, from our side, our problem is we ought to take a real cold look and try to see the world from their point of view.
Well, that seems to be the difficulty in all areas of U.S. foreign policy, that the U.S. government is just arbitrarily put upon by irrational bad guys everywhere for no good reason other than we're wonderful and we march against breast cancer and do all these wonderful things, and they just can't stand that. And the result has been this horrifying foreign policy and the righteousness behind it. It's interesting that even Russell Kirk back in '91 gave this great speech at the Heritage Foundation where he condemned this kind of spirit, this haughty spirit of our government is always right, and yet he would be called a pinko commie by the neocons today.
Exactly. He was talking about the hubris that had taken over America in the wake of its Cold War victory. Now, I don't believe Reagan would have behaved this way toward Putin, and Nixon certainly would not have done so. But let's take a look at they say that Putin is defying us in Syria. What is he doing in Syria? I'm not a fan of President Assad, but he's been a long time ally of the Russians. They have a naval base of some kind at Latakia. They've sold him weapons, and Assad is under assault from rebels, which include the al-Qaeda terrorists, who are the dominant force there. And the Russians are standing by their ally, as we did not stand by ours, Mubarak. And when we helped dump him over. And why should they adapt their policy toward American policy when their own interests, as they see them, mean consistency with what they have been going for the last 20 years? Again, we don't seem to be able to understand things from their point of view, and Putin's got a good question when he asks, why are you Americans supporting rebels whose leading fighting force are the very people who brought down the Twin Towers?
These are good questions. These are good questions for John McCain.
The McCainiacs, as I've called them. Did you see what McCain said? I'm going to have to dig it up, but McCain said, look, if they let Snowden in, let's bring Georgia into NATO. In other words, threaten
Yeah.
A possible world war.
Yeah, I know it. I know. Well, did you happen to see, Pat, that column in the Washington Times a few days ago in which Gingrich said that the neocons really have to do some soul searching over the complete how their interventionist policies have completely backfired overseas? Did you see that?
I did. It said Newt's converting on this front as well, I think. But exactly, is this not a valid question? Tom, we just got what the other day? We said, 22 embassies got to be shut down. Al-Qaeda is all over the place. They're threatening our people. And so we go into our fortresses over there. First, Obama has said that, Al-Qaeda was on the run. Secondly, we just lost, in the last decade, 6,000 soldiers, 40,000 wounded, lost $2 trillion, killed hundreds of thousands of people, created 1 million widows and orphans in Afghanistan and Iraq in the, quote, war on terror, and now the enemy's in more places than it was when the war begun? I mean, does that not ask the question, what were these wars all about?
That, to me, is the best way to spin it. I've had a lot of success talking to people who I think are, some of them are in good faith, just conservatives who just listen to conservative leaders and they adopt the views that they learn there. But look at the results. You know a tree by its fruits, and the results have been. Unless the purpose is to build up Islamic radicalism, then it's been a unmitigated success.
Well, exactly. I mean, Al-Qaeda is. They believe in killing civilians, killing innocents. They're a dreadful bunch of people, but there's no doubt about it. What is their goal? Why were they over here? They are over here because we are over there. They see us as a colonial power, a dominant superpower, a secular power, a Christian power, inside their own countries and their own region, dominating them, and they can't get us out of their region. And so they came over here and engaged in acts of terrible terrorism against us. And then our response was to re-up what we were doing, which was the cause of the attack. We intervened massively in Afghanistan, massively in Iraq, and all over that region, and we created more terrorists than we're killing. And, people were asking these questions 10 years ago. If we go over there, will we create more enemy than we kill? And if you look at what's happening in the last week, where it's no longer in Tora Bora, but Al-Qaeda's in half a dozen countries over there, we have created more enemy than we have killed.
We're talking to Pat Buchanan. Buchanan.org is the website. You can follow him on Twitter at Patrick Buchanan. Before we go to the break, Pat, I want to ask you one quick thing before we talk about the GOP. I want to ask you, it's 1992, you've run a strong insurgent campaign against a sitting president, and then you're at that Republican convention and you're handing over your supporters to George H.W. Bush. Does Pat Buchanan in 2013, does even 5% of Pat Buchanan, looking back at that, say to himself, I should have told him to go stick it?
No, because we did that in 2000 and it didn't work out well.
It never
recall,
does.
Tom.
But you'll go down in history as a hero for having tried it. All right, can you stand by for one more segment after this break?
Okay,
All right.
Sure.
All right, we're coming right back with Pat Buchanan. We're going to talk about Rand Paul and the future of the GOP. That's next on The Peter Schiff Show. Don't go away.
The Peter Schiff Show.
You've heard of Karl Marx, right? Well, now, meet his worst nightmare. This is The Peter Schiff Show.
All right, welcome back to The Peter Schiff Show. Tom Woods in for Peter. Peter's out of town, but I guess Pat Buchanan and I are the second worst nightmare of Karl Marx. Pat, Rand Paul, I just played a clip beginning of this program from your old friend at MSNBC, Chris Matthews, just the other day, in which he predicted, it's very early to say this, obviously, but that Rand would actually wind up being the nominee in 2016. What's your thought on that?
Well, I think if Rand runs, I would see Rand is running stronger than his father, and for a variety of reasons. He's a United States Senator now. He's much younger. His positions are more nuanced and not as stark as those of Ron Paul. But at this point, I think it's a possibility, and I would certainly put him up in the very top tier of the candidates to get the nomination, because I think his appeal is going to be very good in New Hampshire. Iowa's more of a socially conservative state, as is South Carolina. But clearly, I think Rand Paul I think he's going to do very well, and he's going to have a real impact, and I think he already is. He's becoming the lead spokesman voice right now of of sort of the libertarian wing of the Republican Party, but I think it needs a traditionalist conservative appendage in order to win the nomination.
What do you think about Congressman Peter King, who's just been on the rampage against Rand Paul? The other day he said Rand Paul has set the Republican Party back 50 years, which I think it was probably marginally better.
Eisenhower's time. We didn't do badly.
Yeah, that's right. And 50 years ago, they were on the verge of nominating Goldwater. So, I mean, the worst things could happen.
Exactly. And Goldwater, I will say this is when I'm working on a book, Tom, on Nixon, and it deals with 65 to 69 when we put together the 49 state landslides of the next 20 years. But look, Peter King is, I think, he's a very hard-line foreign policy guy, very strongly, pro-Israel. He's very strongly national security, and he's very much an interventionist. And while he's not a neoconservative, he's an old-line conservative. I think his views are very Cold War oriented. I think Rand Paul is much more in line with where America is going tomorrow, and Peter King is much more aligned with America's been yesterday. And I think the idea that he's denouncing the libertarian trend in the Republican Party, I think, is a denunciation of where the country and the party are going to a great degree.
And of course, we can overstate the extent to which Rand Paul is a libertarian. I mean, he uses the word libertarian from time to time, but in his campaign, he denied he was a libertarian, and he's reassured social conservatives that he is not intending to legalize heroin in their neighborhoods and things of this nature. So that aspect of him, I think, has been overstated. I think clearly what King and others are upset about is the fact that he may not be on board for the next half dozen wars that the neocons might want to cook.
Well, exactly, and Rand, it's his anti-interventionism, I think, that bothers the neoconservatives who dominate the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, and to whom a number of congressmen up there respond almost reflexively. And I think at one point Rand Paul suggested maybe we should worry more about the street lights that aren't going on. 60% of them don't work in Detroit, rather than shipping off $5 billion a year to the Middle East after we've borrowed it from China. And so I think these arguments are really, they grate against the neoconservative dominance, the McCain, Lindsey Graham, if you will, who are the visible voices of the party, but whom nobody is following anymore.
Right. No, absolutely, and especially the younger audience, who are internet savvy. When every time McCain makes some inane remark, which is not exactly something you record on your calendar, but his Facebook page is absolutely lit up with people denouncing him. Hardly anybody defends him. So he clearly.
Look on the intervention in. The desire to get the United States to intervene militarily in Syria. The American people don't want it. The Republicans don't want it. Conservatives don't want it. No one wants to get involved in another Middle East civil war when we see the terrible consequences of the last two wars we've been in Iraq and Afghanistan. In the latter, the Taliban are making a comeback, and in the former, the country's breaking up in sectarian and civil war. How many people are going to say all those dead and wounded and all those trillions invested were really wisely invested?
Well, somebody like McCain would say that we had Iraq won, and then we just lost the will. I mean, what do you say to that?
Look, what they're saying, in effect, is the thing wouldn't have gone to hell in a handbasket if we'd stayed there for 100 years.
Yeah, true. Yeah, that was his thing. 100 years.
But look, Americans decided finally that the bleeding and the dying simply weren't worth it in terms of what we were getting from it. And I think they made a wise decision there.
We've got just a few minutes left. I'd just like to ask you, in light of the fact that Iran has new leadership now, what do you think is going on in terms of U.S. policy with Iran? It really has quieted down.
Well, I think Netanyahu is beside himself. He's in the New York Times again this morning, or the Washington Post, denouncing Rouhani and saying they're starting up a new separate nuclear program. What's happened is the Iranian people, by electing someone who, a moderate may not be the proper term. He's very close to the Ayatollah, but someone who is committed to getting sanctions lifted, to reintegrating Iran back with the world and the world community, and to negotiating his nuclear program with the Europeans and with the United States. What the Israelis want, and the Israeli lobby wants, and the neocons want, and McCainiacs want, is a war on Iran. And this individual, I think, offers a real possibility, because if to deliver on what he's promised, he's got to cut a deal on his nuclear program, and the Americans have some guidelines, red lines that have to be met. I think it's an extraordinarily hopeful sign, and the real fear back here is that on my part certainly, is that somehow they're going to, block any kind of deal, any kind of negotiation, any kind of U.S.-Iranian deal, which I think could bring an end to this, 35 years of hostile and antagonistic relations.
Well, we can certainly hope that will happen. That was my interpretation as well. Let me ask you in our final minute. I was going to ask you anyway whether you were working on a book. Is this book that you mentioned? Is this the beginning of the multi-volume Buchanan memoir that we'd all like to read?
Well, this is I was going to do a book on Nixon, and I decided it's too big a book to do the comeback and the presidential years, and I don't want to get into the whole thing, but I do think this is the first book. Hopefully I'll be able to write another one on all the major events in the Nixon White House years in which I was involved, the Cambodian invasion, the Agnew speeches, the Great Silent Majority, Watergate, China trip, the rest of it. But this is on, Tom, it's on how we built the new majority out of the wreckage and ruin of 1964-65, because out of that, as you know, back in those days, we might have gotten wiped out. But there was a real remnant out there of strong, solid conservative support and a movement which had been burned. At the same time, Nixon could deal with the Republican center, and all we had to do was carve away those Catholics in the North and the Southern Protestants from the Democratic Party, and we could build a new majority, and this is how we did it.
Well, Pat, we will look forward to reading that. We're out of time, but I'm so grateful to you for your generosity this morning with your time. Thanks for being here.
Good to talk to you, Tom.